Apologies for the delay of the technical challenges this morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Strategic Leadership Development Forum. I am really happy to host this session on curriculum design for leader development. I think at all of the PME institutions, we have continuous processes for updating curriculum. So I think that the presentation from Marine Corps War College is going to address some of those sort of refinements that we typically do along the way as you reflect back on how a course has gone. And then our second presentation this morning from Professor Chuck Allen and Dr. Joel Hillison and colleagues will address some of the relook at curriculum as external events like the pandemic prompts some reflection and revision of approaches. And so I think we've got a nice balance of presentations this morning for the kind of ongoing refinements of curriculum, as well as refinements that are in response to external events. So I will let the presenters introduce themselves as they start, so I don't take any more of their time away. So over to Dr. Mackenzie and Colonel Murata.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mackenzie. I'm on the faculty at Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. I'm here alongside my teaching partner, the course director for the Leadership and Ethics Department at the Marine Corps War College. And of course, you don't need us to tell you that change is hard and change is humbling. But nevertheless, change is what we need to grow, and change is what we need to do to keep our curriculum fresh and to serve our students in the best way possible. So we're here to talk to you a little bit about the process and the outcome of change, of updating, of refining our curriculum. I will say here at the outset that we have a challenge and opportunity associated with the size of our program. So unlike the very large Army War College student population numbers, we have approximately 30 students each year in our college. And so, of course, with that comes the great opportunity to be able to make change quickly. And that when we do make change, we can implement them in ways that doesn't have as much reverberation. The challenge with that is that when we only have 30 students, that's only 30 students to get our message out to and to share our curriculum with. So again, we take both the challenge and the opportunity to heart when we are thinking about how to keep our curriculum fresh and to keep updating and sort of sharing that growth mindset with our students. So in the next, say, 18 minutes or so, I'm going to turn it over to my teaching partner here in just a moment. But just to give you a sense of what we're after today, first, again, we'll just talk really briefly. Colonel Murata will talk about our students, the curriculum in the Leadership and Ethics Department. And he'll talk about a new assignment, a new assessment practice that he has introduced just this fall. He'll talk about that kind of as like an outcome of some change that we had in mind. And then I'll wrap it up by talking a little bit about some of the processes and some of the new concepts that I was introducing this fall. As you know, change can take the form of process and outcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those. So over to Colonel Murata to kick us off with a little bit about our curriculum.
All right, good morning. So like Lauren said, my name is Colonel Ryan Murata, 31 years in the Marine Corps, infantryman by trade. I spent most of my time in reconnaissance and intelligence. Now I'm on the faculty at McClure, so having a fantastic time there. A little bit of a fish out of water though, so I'm learning as I go. As Lauren said, the student body is about 30 students every single year. This year, we actually have 31 students. And if you're not familiar with the composition of that, they primarily are uniformed service members from all services to include the Coast Guard. But then we also have State Department personnel. We have multiple individuals from across the intelligence community. So it's a pretty diverse group. But as Lauren said, the great thing about it is it's so small that we only break our students into huge seminars, where I know some of the different war colleges have 26, 21 seminars. They have quite a few. So what that does, it allows us to turn on a dime. The nice thing about it is when I want to make a change to the curriculum, there are the administrative things I have to go through as far as page counts and things like that, or reading assignments, and then of course approval from the dean. But literally I could look in the mirror and say, hey, do I want to change that? Okay, change that. And so it's really nice that I can take those opportunities to try things out very quickly. The faculty also is very small. We have 10 faculty members and then 4 within our headquarters, our administrative headquarters there. So socialization of ideas is also very, very easy for us because we just put everybody in one room, we can knock it out very quickly, and we do those meetings about every 2 weeks. So that's a nice thing about being down at the Port College. So getting into what do we do in the leadership and ethics curriculum? Well, we have 3 big items that you can see right here: the strategic leadership, executive development, and then the ethics portions. They're taught basically in chunks. So right now we are in the middle of the ethics portion of that. And then we've already gone through a lot of the executive development. And then later on in the spring, we'll get into some of the strategic leadership. There's a little bit of work that we do with the diplomacy curriculum. So for instance, the strategic negotiations that you see underneath strategic leadership, they learn quite a bit of the historical items that have occurred for different things like the bombing of Hiroshima, some of the other different actions that have occurred from the PRC and how they've interacted through some of the different island chains out in the Pacific. And then what we do is we make the students come up with ethical considerations on decision-making or recommendations that they would give to the joint staff based upon those type of historical events. Now, going into new assessments, essentially what it was, there was a combination of just trying to be practical and setting our students up for success as far as their next job. And when we take a look at most of our students, the next job they're going to, because they're all post-battalion or squadron command, next assignment they're going to go to is they're going to be action officers, more than likely. The majority are going to be action officers, some either service headquarters or the joint staff. And so what do you need to be successful there? Of course, you have to be able to write, and across the curriculum, so the entire War College, they have to be able to write. And as anybody here that's done the grading of those papers, they know that some of those students need a little bit of assistance. And so we're able to provide that. But also they need to understand how to write for the joint staff or for service headquarters as an action officer. And that's not a 5-6 page paper. Nobody will ever read it. That is how can I construct a PowerPoint brief that's going to be delivered and received and sway somebody to the point of view that we were trying to get across, and how do I go ahead and construct an information paper. So that was one of the things I changed, is at least for leadership and ethics, is the assignments that they turn back in, the written assignments, those are made in formats that they would actually use within a The other one was, and it was mentioned in one of the other classes, or one of the other briefs yesterday, was that leadership and ethics is not a one-shot, one-kill thing. You can't just give a class and then next year give another class. There has to be a repetition to it. And so there has to be a mastery of the subject, and then you have to repeat it. So what I did to try to do to instill that into the students was part of what they had to do is they had to take everything that they had been taught up to the point in the fall assessment, and they had to take everything there and they had to construct their own leadership and ethics half-day course. So they had to basically create a turnkey leadership and ethics course that they would give to fellow field grade officers in whatever assignment they were at next. And so the idea behind that is, number one, they had to study it. Everything that we had given them, they had to do a little bit more in-depth study for that, and then come up with the items that they felt were particularly important. And then now, once that was completed, they have something that when they do go into their next assignment, they can actually give to their peers, to their subordinates, whoever that might be, to try to reinforce that not only themselves, but reinforce that into the officers that are serving with them. And then, like I said, we were split into 2 seminars. So then what we did is we took a look at the across the board at all of the assignments. They had turned in a PowerPoint brief that was ready to be briefed to a general officer, and then of course an information paper as a read ahead. We took and selected 2 individuals from each seminar, and those 4 individuals then briefed a 3-star general that we asked to come on in. And then everybody sat around, so they had the opportunity to not only brief a general officer, but then they saw how a general officer thinks, the decision-making that goes on, the questions that were asked, and then the rest of the seminar sat around in a U shape, so they could, because many of them have never seen a general officer being briefed, never been in that room, so they could actually be there and be present to see how that works. And then in the spring, again, playing off of history and ethical decision-making, the assessment, and I'm still working on that one because I'm trying to do joint staff formats, placemats and things like that. But what they will do is they will have to They'll be put into small teams, 3 for, 3 against a recommendation to drop a nuclear weapon on Japan. What I am trying to do though right now is to evolve that into a more recent and relevant type scenario where maybe it's not just World War II, but maybe it's something that happens in present day. But that's being worked right now. And so they will have to present that to a panel of faculty that will be playing the Secretary of Defense, the chairman, and then go from there. So that's where we are right now. And those are some of the changes that I've recommended.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Let me just take the last 5 minutes or so and talk a little bit about some of the process changes that I tried to integrate into our curriculum this fall. For those of you who are familiar with Ted Lasso on Apple TV, this is one of my favorite quotations from the very first episode of the first season. He says, taking on a challenge is a lot like riding a horse, isn't it? If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. So this is something that I have to keep in mind, especially when I get kind of snarky comments from students. I will say a couple of years ago, I piloted a class on the role of failure in teaching and learning. And I do, get a little bit of pushback from students. I can remember actually this year, one of our lead students who's an 06 in Space Force, as I was introducing the class, he was like, are you really talking to War College students about failure? Like he was like in complete disbelief. So I get a lot of pushback on some of these new classes, especially because my stuff is a little bit softer and squishier than the typical kind of military history angle and approach that a lot of our students get. Nonetheless, I do think it's really important. I think it matters. And even though a lot of students might say that some of the classes that I lead, classes like metacognition and critical thinking and maybe emotional intelligence, they might say, oh, this is just common sense. My favorite thing to reply to that comment is, yes, it may be common sense, but I can promise you it's not common practice. So let's talk today about how we can make some of this common practice. So that's the idea, is that like I have to get comfortable with discomfort, right? So again, I'm really grateful for the leadership that we have at the War College because they've been really progressive and flexible with me, bringing in some new ideas into our curriculum. So along with this quotation from Ted Lasso, I also love this idea that he has, which is the goldfish mindset. Anyone familiar with that? Basically what he says is that goldfish have like a 1-second memory. So if they do something really bad or really stupid or wrong, they've forgotten it in a second and they just keep moving forward. Unfortunately, I wish I had that, but I don't. But what I do try to take on is a growth mindset. Again, this is probably really familiar to most of you in the room. This is a concept coined by Carol Dweck, this idea that we always have more to learn. There is always more to learn, and we can always learn from different sources, even if they're unfamiliar. So we keep that in mind, in the back of our minds, as we are preparing for each academic year. And again, along with new assignments, oftentimes we are introducing new readings. Of course, we're trying to keep up to date with the scholarly literature, and at times we're able to introduce some new speakers as well as some new concepts and skill sets, essentially. But I think a lot of this has to do, its success has to do with framing. What are we magnifying and what are we obscuring when we introduce something like emotional intelligence to Marine Corps lieutenant colonels, right? We have to be really careful and precise and deliberate with the way that we frame the value of emotional intelligence, as an example, and also the priming, right? Like, how are we preparing them for this session? And how are we showing them that we've thought of some of the counter arguments, trying to get ahead of some of the criticisms that they may have to offer when we get in front of them in seminar. So at the end of the day, what I'd like to do in the next couple minutes before I turn it over to Dr. Allen and colleagues is just give you an example of one change, one refinement that I think worked pretty well, and one that kind of fell flat, that didn't work as well as I would have liked. Because sometimes I do think the non-example is more memorable than the success. So that's what I'll share. Again, at the end of the day, just to tell you like how I prime the students when I'm going to introduce something new, is that what I'm after, again, at least with my sequences of classes that I lead in the department, is this idea of triple loop learning. This comes from the field of culture education, which is my background. And so what do we mean by triple loop learning? So let's say You know, many of us in the room have teenagers. I have a teenager myself, he's 15. So a triple loop learning is, let's say I snap at him, like he's always questioning everything that I tell him, like what his curfew is and how much screen time he can have, right? And if I snap at him, a single loop learning is like just observing, hey, maybe I was a little harsh with him, like just now. That's a single loop. I observed that. A double loop learning is saying like, oh my gosh, like, why did I do that? Was I hungry? Was I tired? Was it just an accumulation of things? But the triple loop learning is this idea of what are my assumptions? What are the foundations of my beliefs and values that let me think that a teenager should not challenge or question his or her parents, right? So we're looking at the foundations of our beliefs, our values, our culture, say of parenting or of teaching, that cause us to have these sort of disconfirmed expectations. So I'll get back to that in just a second, but I do try to let them know this is what I'm after with my classes. All right, so one of the things that sort of I tried to introduce this semester, this past fall, that didn't work as well as I would have liked, was kind of the introduction of this idea, not my own, of a paradox mindset. And I think each academic field comes at this idea of paradoxes in different ways. But from a leadership perspective, right, a paradox mindset is the kind of the extent to which one is not just accepting of tensions and opposites, but energized by them. And that can be hard to find. Like myself included, I am not as comfortable as I would like to be when it comes to competing opposites and tension. And so just to put this into context, some of the classes that I helped write the lesson cards for and lead seminars for this past fall were things like emotional intelligence, a class on the role of failure in teaching and learning, which I'll get to in just a second. But the middle bullet point just there, the role of narrative in bridging divergent viewpoints. This is a class that I piloted a couple years ago. I tried to update it this year with the work of Peter Coleman. If any of you know him, he's pretty well known at Columbia University. He studies intractable conflict, has a new book out, a famous one called The 5%, and a new one on how we can better understand toxic polarization. And so I designed a new reading with this in mind, this paradox mindset. And I had this pushback like right off the bat, which some of you might be familiar with this, right? Like you have a reading or a resource that has some great content, but perhaps the author is really far left liberal or Democrat, and that comes through in a lot of the examples and a lot of the way that he or she frames these ideas. So the student really pushed back on Peter Coleman's work because the examples he gave, again, the student was like, yeah, right off the bat, the student thinks I'm a white supremacist, so I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to take on any more of this content. So I sort of learned the hard way, and I've had to learn this over the past decade I've been in PME, is that sometimes the messenger is as important as the message itself. And so I think this idea of trying to bring in the value of the paradox mindset and the connection to dialectics was lost in the way that the message was framed in the particular reading. So that was a real struggle. So again, as I'm thinking about these dialectics and the importance of these competing opposites, so what do I mean by this, right? So if we're talking about a class like the role of failure in learning, the role of failure in life, right? There's all these tensions that we have to contend with, right? Like this idea that stress and failure and disappointment and embarrassment, all this can be debilitating, but it can also be enhancing, right? We can accept that we had this, we were turned down for promotion, right? That's a huge failure for us, right? We can accept it, but part of us is still in denial about it, right? We can reveal it to certain colleagues, but we try to conceal it from others, right? We think that this failure might be separate from our identity, but in the same token, it's part of our profession, and therein it's also connected to our identity. So I sort of try to introduce this in the failure class as a way of thinking differently, right? Of updating our thinking when it comes to the role of failure in the learning process. So let me just say, I felt like it worked well in the failure class. This dialectical tensions sort of framework didn't work as well in the role of narrative and bridging divergent viewpoints. So I'm gonna have to go back to that, rethink the new readings and that new concept for next year. I'll just close, and this is the last slide. I'll turn it over to Dr. Allen. I introduced the work of Daniel Pink. He has a brand new book out in 2022 called The Power of Regret. And this really, I think, goes hand in hand with a lot of the research on failure and meaningful failure. Because again, just to connect this back to the idea of dialectics, one of the things that we know from the research on when we learn from failure and when we don't, is that when we sort of attach an internal attribution to the failure, we tend to learn from it more than when we blame others or have an external attribution. But at the same time, both the internal and external attributions are competing in our minds, right? That sort of cognitive dissonance that we all experience and that we need for growth in any relationship, personal or professional. So the last thing I'll mention is that an assignment that I give the students for, it's only for participation credit, but it is like a 3-page essay. I ask them, hey, knowing what you know now about these different ways of framing and thinking about failure, what advice would you give your former self when you experience this perceived failure that you're going to write about for this paper? And I give them, 4 or 5 different kind of skills or tools or frameworks to think differently about the failure. And Daniel Pink's work on regret is just awesome, and I think has really contributed nicely to this work on failure. And the main premise of his book is that regret makes us human, regret makes us better. And he's the author of a huge world regret survey that has had over 19,000 participants. And from those inputs on what people report as their biggest regrets in life, he came up with these 4 categories of different kinds of regret. So we talked about that in class. And I will say in closing here, just like the best moment for me in this fall semester was when a student in the work college said to me, because I read this regret section, this article, I actually reached out to a colleague that I had lost touch with over the past decade, and I reconnected with him, and I realized that I just didn't want to go to my deathbed having not kept up with that relationship. It was really important to me. And again, as soft and squishy as that might sound, that was like just this huge moment for me as an educator that a student reconnected with an old colleague. So I brought in these categories. I think they worked really well in our discussion about failure. And so, yeah, again, the whole idea with this coursework is to help sort of broaden students' response strategies when they come up to, an obstacle, to friction, or to failure. So I will close there. Again, these are some ideas that I kind of wish I had done before, just introduced them now. But to quote the old Chinese proverb, right, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So thanks so much for your attention. Over to Dr.